Well, for those of you that don't recognize the face on the screen, I will introduce this as Bart Sibrel, who is a filmmaker. He is, let's see, he's an investigative reporter. You've got lots of different credits, and I think you have the dubious distinction of probably being one of the only people that's been decked by an astronaut. So that's,
Well, that and their ex-wives.
oh,
Yes.
really? I
Yeah.
had no
But that's
idea.
another story. Another story.
Oh, you don't want to disclose. Okay, so I had no idea that there were ex-wives involved in the whole story. But as you say, that may be for another time. We want to really kind of dig into the situation at hand, which is astronauts gone wild. And also, I guess we could go right back to a funny thing happening on the way to the moon. You know, it seems like things may not have been as advertised, and it's a great disappointment because we all remember where we were, you know, in our generation. I'm a little bit older than you, but we can usually remember where we were on, what was it, the 20th of July or the 19th of July? You tell me, 1969.
Well, they allegedly walked on the moon on the 20th. Yeah.
Right.
Launched
Well,
on
I
the
know where
16th.
we were. Do we know where they were? That, I guess that's the big question. So I'm gonna
There you go.
I'm gonna just let you set the scene here. Now, you came from. Now, your dad was in the military, was he?
That's right. He was in the Air Force.
Okay, and so you had quite an affinity with the whole space program. You were you a wannabe astronaut yourself at the point that men.
No, I just found it fascinating, and I was very fascinated with aircraft naturally, growing up in that environment. And my dad got a VIP package of color prints, put them up on the wall, and so I looked at the prints of Apollo 11 on the wall for 10 years, from 4 to 14, before I even considered the possibility that they might be faked from a television show that I saw. And then I became a filmmaker by the age 24 and ended up producing a film for the guy saw who produced the TV show I saw 10 years earlier. And that's how I got in touch with Bill Casing and eventually decided to make the film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, under the theory that it might be true that the moon landings were staged. After all, the Soviets had a 5-1 advantage in space first and man hours. And it's an event that can't be repeated 50 years later, which is a little unusual. If you look at any milestone in history, whether it's Columbus sailing to the New World, or the Wright brothers making first flight, or flying across the Atlantic, or breaking the sound barrier, or Mount Everest, or going to
Mm-hmm.
the South Pole, it's the only time in world history when an event was done, a milestone was made, and 50 years later, no one can repeat it. It's never happened in the history of technology because technology does not go backwards unless the moon landings are real. And then you come to find out they destroyed all of the evidence that could prove or disprove whether they could technically reach the moon. All the lunar module specifications, the rocket specifications, all that they deliberately destroyed, as well as all the telemetry data as to where the rocket really was during the flight. All of that has been destroyed. And then the original videotapes, all those got destroyed or misplaced.
It's
And
hard to
so
keep
you
track.
realize, well, they say they deliberately destroyed the technology to go to the moon. That's
Mm.
what Don Pettit, one of their astronauts, just said on camera. And so you think if Bill Gates spent $150 billion making the first computer, once he was finished, would he then throw it into a furnace and all the blueprints on how to make it? They didn't even do that with the atomic bomb, which is what they should have done, but they didn't. So they're certainly not going to destroy the technology unless they faked it and the schematics could prove it didn't have enough computing power or fuel or battery power to run the air conditioning in 250 degrees for 3 days. If the schematics could prove that it could not be done, then they would destroy it. So the fact that they destroyed the information is proof that they didn't go. Because if they really went and spent $150 billion, they would have never destroyed that technology. However, if they faked it, they would definitely destroy the blueprints because it could be used later to prove that it was a physical impossibility, which is exactly what they did, which proves they didn't go. Because if they really went, they would have never destroyed the information. They would have only destroyed it to cover the tracks of a false mission which is what they did, which means they didn't go. I mean, it's really amazing how self-evident this is. They're claiming they went 1,000 times farther than they can travel today with 50 years more technology, and then they did it with less computing power than a cell phone, 1 millionth the computing power of a cell phone. And they're claiming they did it on the first attempt with 50-year-old technology, and no one can do it 50 years later. I mean, it's just a remarkable claim.
There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, I guess, involved with the people that were there and watching it on TV. In my case, it was when I was 10 years old, and the whole family gathered around the TV set, and there we were watching this grainy picture. And it's, who would ever do this in front of the whole world? I mean, that's pretty gutsy, isn't it? To actually do something that isn't, again, it's not as advertised, because we don't really necessarily know whether people have been to the moon or whether they've been to Mars or anything else, but all we can look at is the evidence, and the evidence that they present to us is less than credible. Now, one of the things that I ask people, ever since it became a question for me, because I like to look at evidence, is, can we get through the Van Allen radiation belts? And a lot of people don't know about that. And apparently the astronauts like Buzz Aldrin wasn't aware that there was such a thing when you interviewed him. Can you tell me a little bit about that interview? And I might actually play a little clip when I edit this together. But right now you can just give the viewers a sense of what that was like to interview Buzz and have him say he wasn't aware that they went through the Van Allen radiation belts.
Well, after the making of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which shows newly discovered footage of fake photography, unedited, of them faking a shot right in front of your eyes, and the CIA telling them to only speak after 4 seconds go by to give the impression they're further away from the Earth than they really were. They're supposed to be halfway to the moon during this footage, and we're seeing a little blue Earth with black around it. It ends up being a completely fake scene. And we hear the CIA telling them, don't answer the question right away because you're really still in Earth orbit. And if you answer too quickly, to give away that fact. So they counted off 4 seconds. We hear crystal clear on the third track talk. The CIA prompting them to speak after 4 seconds go by. I mean, it's unbelievable. So after that film came out, I thought, well, why don't we just ask them to swear in a Bible? We'll try to find them at public events if they don't give interviews, and then try to do sit-down interviews with them. And it was under those circumstances where Buzz Aldrin, kind of admitted twice on camera that I was right. He said, why don't you talk to the administrator of NASA? I'm just a passenger. Well, didn't he allegedly pilot the lunar module? But he just said he was only a passenger, going up, riding around, and coming down completely out of his control. He was a passenger.
Yeah. Well,
and then he said,
and
this makes you a famous person. He said, and this makes you some famous person for having discovered all this. Like, he was mad. He thought the story had broken worldwide for a few minutes. And he was saying my motives were insincere, which means I was right. I mean, he never said I was wrong. He said, oh, and you're doing this to become famous. How can I become famous if I'm wrong, if they really went to the moon? And then we have Edgar Mitchell's son. They kick us out. I mean, the guy's alleged peace guru. Says I don't hit people, and then 5 seconds later, you can't go 5 seconds without lying, and your back is turned to him, he kicks you. And then in the hustle and bustle, we leave the camera recording in the back seat, and the microphone is on him on the inside, and his son says, do you want me to call the CIA and have me assassinated? Now, if they really went to the moon, why would they have to assassinate me?
Well, and also, it's nice that they have the hot phone right there to the CIA. They can just pick it up, apparently, and have people whacked. I mean, that's the part that I found really interesting about the hot mic, was not even so much that, it's one thing when you say, do you want me to go out and whack them? Do you want me to grab a gun or whatever? But it's like, oh, I'll just get my buddy over there at the CIA to do the job.
I'm not supposed to tell people this, but for emergencies, it's 911, and when you want to have someone killed, it's 912. So make sure you make that distinction there. Mm-hmm. But then Alan Bean, says he didn't go through the radiation belts. And people don't understand this, but the space shuttle, the space station, that's about 250 miles above the Earth. So, I mean, pick a place that's 250 miles from you, make it vertical, and that's as far as they go on a 1 foot model of the globe, that'd be like half an inch above the globe. And the moon is 30 globes away. You see, there's a big difference here. So about 1,000 miles up is this barrier called the Van Allen radiation belt. It begins at 1,000 miles and extends 25,000 miles. It's just condensed radiation, and it protects the Earth from other galactic and solar radiation, but in itself collects it. So the only time humans are said to have gone through the radiation would be to the moon. They'd have to go through it to reach the moon. And the Orion project 3 years ago, the Kelly Smith works at NASA, and he said that it's dangerous radiation, and the technology to protect astronauts from it has yet to be invented.
Well,
So how did they go to the moon?
Well, I did my research and I went on and I found a fellow that was talking about how, in fact, they did have enough protection from the radiation. But again, we can ask some logical questions. We don't have to go into conspiracy theories because it's just conspiracy fact, really, or conspiracy
Well, yeah,
evidence.
it is a fact. I mean, I was doing the film under the theory it might be true. And then 3.5 years into a 5 year, $500,000 project, I pop in the tape. It says on the screen, "Do not show the public." And then they are faking a shot over and over again right in front of you, talking about how they're faking it. And the CIA is prompting them when to speak. I mean, it's crystal clear they're faking being halfway to the moon, which means they couldn't go halfway. They can't leave Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 50 years later, the farthest they can go is the farthest they went then. They cannot leave Earth orbit in a manned vehicle. NASA admitted that in the Orion project. They said the field is dangerous radiation, and the technology to protect astronauts from it has yet to be invented. Then, of course, how did they go to the moon all those times? Which means they did not go to the moon. So they indirectly admitted that the moon landings are fake. And then when I asked them, I mean, the Orion unmanned vehicle goes up to the radiation belts and comes down with 2 Geiger counters on board. So the whole point of the mission was to measure the radiation. So even though in March of 1959, Scientific American magazine has an article written by Van Allen, and he said that the radiation is 5 to 100 times a lethal dose. It says so right there in the article. He says the only way to reach the moon would be to launch at the North or South Pole where there's an opening in the radiation, which they couldn't do because it's sub-zero temperatures. All the parts would fail. So, I mean, it's right there, in a publication that says it's dangerous. And then they repeat it here in the Orion project. And I ask them, what are the Geiger counter readings? And they say that information is classified. And I'm like, why would the temperature of the sun or the amount of helium in Jupiter's atmosphere be classified? We're just measuring a part of nature. Radiation belts is part of nature. Why would how much radiation is in nature be classified? It would only be because it would prove that they could not go through it and survive in the Apollo equipment. And that's why the information is classified.
Well, speaking of equipment, I mean, they did have the lunar rover. There was no sort of way given as to how they actually got it there. It just miraculously appeared in place without any tire tracks. It was just there on the moon. That was a later mission. But there are all these things that, we just have this idea that, it must have happened because there it is. And when you start thinking about it, the fact that they had to have these batteries, I'm wondering why we don't have the batteries that last what was it? I think it was 36 hours or something in a row without having to be recharged. And I don't know about you, but I'm having a bit of a hard time with keeping battery power now. And it's how many years later? We talking 50 years? It's unbelievable that it's 50
Well, that's
years.
why they destroyed the schematics, because they're claiming they have a car, basically, a vehicle, the lunar module sitting on the moon in 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and they say it gets down to 72 degrees. I mean, it's so arrogant. Not like 98 and it's a little hot in here, or not like 60 and it's cold in here. We're so arrogant.
It's
72 degrees. And how did you power the air conditioning? Batteries. And they had basically car batteries. 10 or 20 car batteries that they're claiming could run the air conditioning for 3 days against 250 degree heat and get it down to, the bank of car batteries, I don't know how long that would last. Maybe 5 hours. And then it would probably get it down to about 150 degrees out of 250. It'd still be 150 degrees in there.
And it's the weight
Anyway,
of these
you know,
batteries too.
the weight
You've
of
got
them, and then
you got a
they
little
didn't have the
tiny
power.
capsule.
The rocket didn't have enough fuel. Von Braun said so in a book he published. He said you'd have to have 3 rockets, each taller than the Empire State Building,
Right.
each weighing more than 800,000 tons. And the Apollo Saturn V rocket was 2,500 tons. It's a difference of almost 30,000%. So if the guy is off by 30,000%, and this is the guy you trust to go to the moon, I don't see how he could get there, or he's lying. I mean, it's one of the two. And him and Van Allen, they played ball, and that's what most of the astronauts do. And even a lot, to me, the window shot, them faking the halfway to the moon, that's to me what convinced me. But other people, they see their expressions at their press conference where they look like they're at a funeral of their mother. They're like all just unhappy, can't believe they're there, can't believe they don't want to talk, they keep passing the buck. I don't want to answer this question. And they look so depressed at the first press conference that should be like champagne Super Bowl locker room. They act like they're at a funeral. I mean, so many people are convinced just by that. That's illogical. Those are the expressions of men forced to lie, not people who
Or
just survive.
my question was farther down the line was going to be: do you think that anything to do with the MK Ultra program might have had to do with the space program as well? Because I know that they were looking into all of the different ways that they could, basically keep people under control. And now that we see Wormwood on Netflix, we're noticing that there is a lot of mind control going on, experimentation, that sort of thing. So my sense is that there could have been a facet of that going on as well, and people like Gus Grissom were not under the same control and therefore had to be gotten rid of. But these were the ones that were easily manipulated, malleable, or whatever. And that's my nice way of putting it, because I want to think that people couldn't lie to that extent, and that they must have, or maybe their families were being threatened. I'm not sure exactly how they get people to do that, but what do you think about the MK Ultra idea?
Well, I'm sure the MK Ultra storyline is fairly accurate, but it doesn't. I don't think they used it in regard to the moon missions. For one, you had to have people who were completely sober and alert. They were faking the moon landing. They had to improvise. They had to cover for mistakes. You couldn't trust that someone sleepwalking. They tried. The first thing they use is they bribe people. What would you like? Wine, women, or song, and what millions of quantity. And if you cooperate, then you're in the same boat with them. You're criminals with them. You're the buddies, whatever. And if that doesn't work, then they threaten you, your life, or the life of your family, or whatever. And then you reluctantly cooperate. But they wanted these people sober. They wanted them alert. And they're just liars. That's all. That's why Neil Armstrong hardly ever gave any interviews. He doesn't like to lie. On the 25th anniversary of the event, 24 years ago, he said, holding back tears, perhaps someday you'll be able to remove one of truth's protective layers. I mean, the guy's saying it right there. And then, Michael Collins doesn't give interviews, so it's only one out of the three, who continually blabs Buzz Aldrin about it. And, to his own peril. That's all I can say.
Well, it seems to me that there has to be a lot of vanity involved in this too, because to expose this at this point, I mean, they got a lot out of it in and of itself, being the first people to go to the moon, and I mean, they lived their whole lives that way. Think of it. They only recently died, but that was their entire identity, their whole life. It's like saying that Mick Jagger wasn't really part of the Rolling Stones or something. I was just faking it the whole time. I mean, you're out in front of a lot of people, and for them to realize that you're not who you say you are, I mean, that's a huge blow to one's own self-identity as well. I mean, I'm looking at the psychological side of it, but it's very hard for us to...
Psychologically, if I walked on the moon and really did it and survived, and someone thought otherwise, I would find that very funny. I mean, if someone said, "Well, you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon," I'd say, "Sure, swear on a stack." I find that hysterical.
Right.
But what they act like is I'm coming up to them in front of their wives and asking, "How's your mistress doing?"
Right.
And because they are getting caught, they are criminals. They lie to their wives, their children, their grandchildren. They don't know the truth about it. They lie to everybody, the priest, every future presidents. They all lie to them about it. And they got away with it. They easily got away with it. And there's so many people who believe that they're real that they don't care. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. I've gotten away with it for so long now because logic and reason, 50 years, and you can't repeat. That's like saying I did cold fusion 50 years ago, but I can't do it today.
Yeah,
With 10,
we don't
you
we
know,
decided free energy wasn't for us. And I
with
mean,
50
even the
years, yeah.
technology that's involved in all of these different aspects, the space suits, I'm thinking about going to Fukushima and maybe helping out there using some of the radiation shields that they had available then to get through the Van Allen radiation belts. Apparently it was Alan Bean, I'm sorry. He was the one that said that apparently they did. They just closed their eyes and they thought pleasant thoughts and they got through it and it was fine. It seemed like just such an easy thing because they had this shielding. Apparently the capsule they were in was like multiple layers of aluminum foil that were squished together because they were getting cold in the capsule. Apparently
Yeah,
they
but
were.
the real barrier was the fact that it was Arby's wrappers. It's that
Oh,
extra,
right. Yeah,
extra
yeah. You got
roast
the
beef
grease,
layer that really protects you.
right? I hadn't thought about that.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's if they could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1 millionth the computing power of a cell phone in 1969, men would have been walking on Mars 25 years ago.
Well, for those of us
I
that are
mean,
old enough to remember that there were such things as calculators, but they came along later because I think that was when I got into high school. We finally had the computing power to have our own calculator, and apparently that was the same level of computing power that took those guys to the moon. And not only that, but got them to rendezvous with, the LEM had to go back and what were they going, 17,000 miles an hour or something around the
where
moon? And
they were going allegedly 4,000 miles an hour.
oh, I'm sorry,
So
they weren't
they went
exactly.
from whatever. It's still an impossibility. They're going from zero, perfectly synchronized. If they were off, I figure by more than 1/10 of a second, they would have missed each other. And to say that the processing power back then could have calculated that in real time is just, I don't think it could happen. That's why they destroyed the information, the schematics, and everything. And it's just a fairy tale and how Santa goes around and drops presents in everyone's chimney all in one night. And if you think about it, it's really the only time a conspiracy is positive. I mean, whoever killed JFK, whether it's Oswald or Bush Sr. or Nixon, whoever, he's dead. Whoever did 9/11, all those people are still dead. Whoever did it, if it's the Saudis or the Arabs or Cheney or whoever. But this is a positive conspiracy. I'm taking candy away from you here. The people cried. They burned in their brains. America's on the moon. And now people who didn't have that, false impression, that programming, they're able to look at it objectively. But some people, it is truly a religion to them. When the rocket is being launched, they say, "My God."
Mm-hmm.
It is their God. I've talked to a professor at a major university who said if he saw one of the Apollo astronauts confess on national TV that it was all fake, he'd still think that they went to the moon.
This has interesting implications for those of us that are
Amazing.
believers. I mean, that is amazing, but it
There's nothing.
is.
I mean, I talked to one
It's
guy who
not
said there's nothing you could say,
nothing you
nothing you
could
could
say.
show me that would make me think that they're fake.
But they're the same
Nothing.
people that if you said you're a Christian, they go, "Oh, come on, how can you believe in all that garbage? Guys walking on water and donkeys talking and that sort of
I
thing."
walked on water too, like Michigan during winter. You know,
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing from that perspective because I think if you're part of a church, if you're part of a believing community, those are often the people that are the hardest to convince that the government would hoodwink us. Now, I had the advantage of being alive when Kent State happened, and I was a protester at the time, very young, but we were harboring draft dodgers up here in Canada, in case you didn't know. And I got some firsthand stories, so I just got my eyes opened quite early about the whole Vietnam thing. And we were doing some protesting, and I saw Kent State the day before I turned into a teenager. I turned into a teenager magically, and that was May 4th, 1970, and they were killing students. And I just thought, well, gosh, if the government could be sending people over to Vietnam on a false pretense and killing students, there's something up here. So it was an early awakening for me, but I know a lot of people have a very difficult time believing that the government could do anything other than just this nice straight ahead program of being for the people all the time.
Well, they admitted, John McNamara, I think he admitted that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was allegedly the North Vietnamese attacking Americans, that was staged by the CIA to garner support for entering the Vietnam War. So they're saying the whole reason why 50,000 Americans and a million Vietnamese died, that they staged the opening of that to get people support. They admitted that. And that was a couple of years after Kennedy was killed and a couple of years before the moon landings were faked. I mean, who are they really hurting other than a few people they did kill to keep it a secret? It's Nixon was president. He doesn't even show up for the launch. I mean, can you imagine? They're going to the moon for the first time and he's not even there for the launch because who knew it would work? Maybe they'd get away with it. Maybe they couldn't get away with it. Maybe they'd get caught. And there he was shaking Neil Armstrong's hand the day before, wanted to distance himself a little bit. Tricky Dick Nixon was president at the time. And he said the number one enemy of the United States are domestic protests, anti-war. And so this is a pep rally. I mean, otherwise, according to Bill Casey, he saw a memo that said the odds of them going on the first attempt and coming back alive was 1 in 10,000. So
Well,
they
even
could
von
they could
Braun,
take the chance. Yeah,
yeah, von Braun was saying that you need a space station. You have to do it in three
first.
stages, I believe, and
Yeah,
you
you'd have
needed
to have a space station.
yeah, so that would have been the first step. And in his own words, there's quite a nice little 30-minute overview of the space program, according to him. And I like to look at people in their own words because he was in charge of the NASA program at that time after he was the SS and after the war.
Yeah, it's amazing it's amazing he put in writing in the 50s that it would take, 30,000 times more fuel than they actually used to go to the moon. And then Van Allen put in writing it's 5 to 100 times a lethal dose, the Van Allen radiation belts. And then CNN reports when they get within 600 miles of it that the radiation is more dangerous than previously believed. Well, previously believed is easily going through it. But if it's more dangerous than that, how do people 600 miles from it know more than people are in the middle of it? It's not possible unless they weren't in the middle of it and they never left Earth orbit.
Well,
And it's like they have to admit it. But if they don't, then they're painting over mold. What happens when you paint over mold and live in the house? That's what they're doing. That's what they're going to suffer.
That's a good way of putting it.
They think I'm unpatriotic by bringing this up. I'm extremely patriotic. That's why I bring it up, to get rid of this disease, to heal our country, to confess it and move on. Otherwise, they're painting over mold. It's going to completely bankrupt morally, ethically, criminally the country because the people who did this are at large.
Well, it's interesting that they would paint you as being unpatriotic. I find that to be the most interesting thing because I'm sure you've had every story known to man about rationalizing all of these different things that we've been talking about because people have this way of being able to say, well, that's because this, that, and the other thing happened and it all came together. And so von Braun and all of these other experts were wrong in the end because clearly we did do that. We did go to the moon. And so I'm curious about some of the ways that people rationalize with you because you're out front and you didn't have to put yourself in this position. It was like most people that I interview, they can't go along with a lie when they start to see it and they actually start to expose it because that's kind of what you do when you're character driven, when you can't hang on to a lie. So it's the opposite of being unpatriotic. It's the only thing you can do when you see something, maybe as a Christian particularly, when you see something that is a lie, it's important to expose it. So tell me about that experience for you after you started to embark on this project.
Well, the church I was going to heard on the news that I was punched by Buzz Aldrin, and they kicked me out of the church. That was the minister there. He knew I was working on the project, and he said, "Bart, there's nothing you could ever say that would convince me that the moon landings are fake." And the guy's just arrogant. It's amazing how arrogant people can be who are supposed to be humble. And it's like no matter what evidence, it's like if someone confesses on TV who was there that they were fake, they still think they win anyway. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount. The Bible talks about this. It's self-deceived, deceiving others and yourself. And they use television. I mean, it's amazing. People believe it because they saw it on TV. I mean, it's amazing the amount of power that had. They made it illegal, though, after the quiz show scandal in the late 50s when a guy who Time magazine said on the cover was the smartest man in America, which he was as long as he got the answers in advance. This is key to his success. And so when that was proven to unravel and it was a big scandal, there were congressional hearings, Congress passed a law. You cannot use television to lie to people. So the government broke that law. And then after the end of World War II, 1946, they passed anti-propaganda laws. You cannot use the media for political propaganda. That's what the moon landings were, political propaganda. So the government broke that law.
I thought it was repealed, though. Recently, I thought that Obama...
Yeah, but it wasn't repealed in 1969.
No, that's
right?
True. But it is interesting to note.
1946 through 2018. So 1969, they committed a felony. Right. I mean, it's amazing. And then who did it? Of course, the CIA. And then these are the people who run the country. That what's his name on the other ticket vice president candidate says they're 6 ways from Sunday from the CIA messing with you, so you better mind your business or something. It's all true. Why do you think they record everything? It's just a database for them to, if you ever run for office and you don't play ball, they can dig it up and find out who your girlfriend or boyfriend was when you're married to somebody else. I mean, everybody's got dirt, and that's the whole point. It's just blackmail. They bribe you, and hopefully that'll work. If not, they blackmail you, you know? Mm-hmm. And very few people stand up to that. If people stood up to that, we wouldn't be in the situation that we were. I mean, the astronauts could have come forward at the press conference and said, I have some terrible news, folks, but my children were threatened. Their lives were threatened. You know, and right then, that's why the truth sets you free, because then he would have been protected. He fell under the bully's threat. Say anything will kill you, but it was saying something that would have made him unkillable, that would have protected him. Because once he confessed, he would have had Secret Service and FBI all surrounding him to protect him. And, you know, so what can you do? It's just terrible.
The what's happening
now. National heroes of our country are liars. Yep. They give them Congressional Medals of Honor for lying, and those are the heroes of our country, are people who lie for a living. And their whole heroism is based on a lie. They completely contrived TV sets, and then they did ticker tape parades for the guys. It's unbelievable. This is our country. Does anybody care? You know?
Well, the interesting thing is, and I don't think it's a political situation. I think it addresses exactly that. You've got somebody that cannot be co-opted, who comes forward with their own money and doesn't really care what you dig up on him. And he says, you know what, we're going to expose these guys for what they are. And he's got his Twitter account, and he's got all these different ways of bypassing the Mockingbird media, whatever you want to call it. He's got enough smarts to be able to bypass all of that, and think what you will, but there's a reason why they're trying to take him out any way that they can, because here's a person who is basically trying to expose things. But I like his technique too, because he did mention going back to the moon, and my sense of it is, we know who I'm talking about. I don't want to go into it too much because people see it as political, but I like the idea that he, as a president, has come forward and said, you know what, I think we will go back to the moon. And my sense of it is that he's doing it as a way of proving what he already knows to be true, which is that we didn't go to the moon. Am I onto something there, or am I off base?
Well, the reason why I did the project, Johnny, is because it dawned on me that if they did not go to the moon, that's more profound than if they had actually gone. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about the two possibilities historically. Either they went and got it somehow, they did it on the very first time, even though they can't repeat it today. That would have a certain level of significance. But if they couldn't do it, they lied about it, they embezzled money, they murdered people. That's more profound than if they'd actually gone. And when I realized that could very well be true, it's like a cure for cancer that someone's sitting on. We have one of the greatest events in human history is the faking of the moon landing. And they're afraid to tell the truth. We cannot go forward. We cannot overcome until the truth is known. Pardon everybody involved. It's not about prosecution. The truth is more important. Everyone's going to, I mean, these guys are old anyway, about to face eternal judgment anyway, right? If there's someone involved in JFK or 9/11, give them complete amnesty just for telling the truth. Even if it's the murderer himself, the most wicked person you could think of, confesses, give him amnesty. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
The truth is more important, you know?
So,
And
so
this is
this
a
isn't a
terrible,
matter of
terrible.
vindication or any or trying to get back at somebody or any of this stuff. It's just basically we want to clear the table and actually be able to do some real research because their hands are tied at this time. They're taking billions of dollars from the American taxpayers, and my sense of it is it's going to some dark projects. It may, as is typical of the CIA, they find ways of siphoning money from the people or from the drug money or whatever it is so that it doesn't have to be accounted for in the budget. And they're doing things that are not in our best interest, shall we say. That's my sense of things. And that is also part of the cover-up as well. And I think that's important for us to bring to the light because there's some things going on that we need to know about. And I don't think it's about aliens. I think it might have a lot to do with the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us about.
Well, here's a historical fact. The United States government faked the moon landing. They haven't acknowledged it. Therefore, those criminals are still in power. So, did Congress and the Senate vote to fake the moon landing? No, they did not. They were overridden, and someone above them faked the moon landing, which means that the government is not run by the Congress and the Senate because they didn't approve faking the moon landing. They weren't even asked. So, whoever that is who faked the moon landing, that's the entity that is running the United States government, and that entity is the CIA, NSA, NRO, whatever they want to call themselves. It's the intelligence community that the guy warned, 6 ways from Sunday, because they record everything you've ever done, you know, and they'll blackmail you. You know what I mean? It's amazing that private conversations of presidents are released into the media word for word, and no one asks, how did that information get out? A president of the United States' phone call is being monitored. Remember the guy like 20 years ago? Was he from Chicago and he was governor and he was allegedly going to sell influence of Obama's Senate seat or state Senate seat or something like that? And no one asked the question, what was the federal government doing listening to the private conversations of the governor of a state? What were they doing? You know,
Seems like
and
the important
you know,
questions are not being asked and they're sort of being put to the side while at the same time we're pushing this agenda of complete hoax and fakery. I mean, doesn't matter really what we're looking at. And I think it didn't start with the moon landings. It certainly, who knows about Pearl Harbor or any of these other things that create a situation where, oh gosh, now we'll have to go to war. And you look at who's benefiting from that. And it's not about oil. It's not about this, that, or the other thing. It's about that there's some bankers that are enriching themselves. They're, and they're bringing people like von Braun, supposedly the enemy, over to work on the space program. I mean, you look at the whole confluence of events, and that was not very far away from the Second World War. We were not in a position where all of a sudden Germans were, great and welcome in the country. But we've got basically NASA was the Nazi Party. I mean, they were basically a bunch of people who had been brought over from the remnants, I guess, from the war, and set up into this new space program. And so I wonder what was at the heart of that and what they were carrying on with that may have been started during the Second World War. There was a lot of technology that was going on at that time that, got, sidelined by losing the war. So we
yes,
got to
well,
keep
what
going.
can you do?
What can you do? You can just start it again under something very, this is what I find interesting. They don't, really change it too much. Let's call it NASA. It sounds, that way we won't forget. It's like, marrying somebody who has a similar name so that you don't call her by the wrong name. You don't want to get that. And
Well, Bill
I don't.
always said that NASA stood for never a straight answer.
Uh huh. Uh huh. Yeah, I think that they were carrying on a tradition, and there's no surprise to me that we have these scientists that were brought into the program there. But that aside, now I'm a photographer. I used to use a Hasselblad camera, and this is the thing that was really telling to me, because when you interviewed, now I'm pretty sure you did the interview with the creator of of that particular camera, or did the interview where the fellow, was it in Sweden, that was saying that it was really no different than any other Hasselblad, because a lot of people will say, well, those were special cameras, just like special suits and special spaceships and that sort of thing. So you look at some of the most simple things, the Occam's razor of the whole thing, and you say, well, can you use a Hasselblad? I had a hard time changing film at a wedding when I was using Hasselblad. I had somebody that handed me the back with a new roll of film in it, because it was very hard to get onto the spool, and people may not understand that now because we're not using film in the same way. But it's a big 120 roll of film that you got to put in there. It's quite wide, and you got to get onto the sprockets. And not only that, but you got to do it in the dark, because it's actually exposed to the light. I'm just putting this forward because I'm a third generation photographer, and I remember people having to go in the darkroom to do this. They're doing it out in the sun. They're doing it with their big gloves on. And it's amazing dexterity. So I thought, well, gosh, they must have had special cameras to do this, or backs loaded with film. Or what did you find out about that did you actually conduct that interview, or was it just part of the movie? I can't remember how that worked, but the interview I'm talking about.
Yeah, that was for Fox's TV special Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon?
Okay.
They were originally going to air A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, and then Fox's legal department said that they couldn't do it. And so they kind of hired me as a consultant, and we started this show called Conspiracy Theory. And they interviewed me, and they interviewed Bill Casing. They interviewed the gentleman who made the cameras. Yeah, to me, the most convincing thing of that film, and you can go to Sibrel.com, and it's linked among the other moon landing films on my YouTube channel. What convinced me is when the guy who designed the camera says it looks like the astronaut standing in electrical light. I can't explain that, and he looks embarrassed. And then my clip, when I say I'd bet my life that they didn't go to the moon, and I'm a filmmaker. My job is to make fake scenes look real. I got a compliment from a colleague. Said, like, Bart, I love the way you use this exactly. The way you used the sunset out the window. That was beautiful. And I said, well, that wasn't the sunset. That was an electrical light, pretending to be the sunset. So I could fool another filmmaker. And so my job is to make fake scenes look real. And that's how I can tell you 100% that these pictures that they claim were on the moon were in a television studio. No question about it. Electrical lighting. And there's so much more evidence. Yeah. That we didn't go to the moon than we did. I mean, right now you're crazy if you think the moon landings are fake. A day is coming soon when you will be crazy if you ever thought that they were real.
That's a nice soundbite right there. I think, Bart Sibrel saying that, I mean, gosh, it's absolutely going to come to the point where I think some of the folks like yourself who have had to go through this years and years and years of ridicule and I don't know, being kicked out of churches and being maligned. I just feel that there's going to come a day when that has to be revealed as what it is. It's the way that God works. He likes to reveal things in the end. It's almost like he allows people to paint themselves into a corner. I think of the story of Haman in Esther. That's one of my favorites, where he's building the gallows so that when the king finally decides that he's going to kill all the folks out there, the Jews, he's going to have the gallows ready. And it turns out that he and his sons end up meeting their end there. And that seems to be the way that God puts things together so that we can actually be the creators of our own doom if we're not following him. And I find all of this to be interesting from that point of view as both a Christian and as a researcher and broadcaster, because so few people seem to be able to put these things together and step forward and tell the truth and have the courage to do that. Like Esther, if I perish, I perish. It's a big thing to do, to step forward. Now, how many years have you been involved in this? It would be from 2000, or was it 1999 that the movie came out? It was around that time.
The film came out in 2001. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Just go to Sibrel, Sibrel.com, and click on the YouTube link. You can watch it. Astronauts Gone Wild came out in 2003. The Fox special, I forget when that came out, but that's on there as well. Conspiracy Theory, Did We Go to the Moon? Plus some other really short videos and interviews of people on the street and various things. And then there's a link to the article I wrote at the Sleuth Journal. I would go to Conspiracy Corner, link at Sibrel.com, and go down to about the fifth article, Did We Land on the Moon with 48-year-old technology on the first attempt? You know, there's more than enough evidence. If you really want to know whether they went to the moon or not, they didn't. I used to believe they did, but they didn't. You have to face, that hard and bitter pill, finding out there's no Santa Claus. It's a lot of tears. And yes, I used to think they were real. I wish it was true. But it's the greatest boast of humankind. We open the film with the Tower of Babel, the greatest event to reach the heavens. And then the Titanic, the ship that God himself could not sink. And then Nixon said, putting a man on the moon is the greatest event since creation, when he knew they weren't there. And it all just reeks of a lie. And who's the father of lies? And what's the greatest accomplishment of mankind? Putting a man on the moon. And what a surprise, like the Titanic, the largest machine yet built. It didn't make it either. And neither was the Tower of Babel finished. You see that? And so there you have it, our modern day, Tower of Babel. And it's true. And it's amazing. They really didn't go to the moon. The United States, the light on a hill, the savior of the world, lied about going to the moon. And they're still trying to defend it every year with specials, how great it was. And it's just a sinking ship. And the sooner they admit it, the better off they'll be.
Well, I have to say there's a tie-in to our earlier conversation about Airstream trailers, because I mentioned that my studio is in an Airstream. Now, when they came back to Earth, they were seen through the back window of an Airstream trailer. And that's how they, the Airstream made its great debut, I suppose, was that the astronauts were doing their quarantine, their 3 days of quarantine in an Airstream trailer. But the thing that I found fascinating was that they would come out and shake Nixon's hand, because if they were being quarantined, it seems like the last person you'd want to infect is the President of the United States. So that was pointed out to a friend of mine who is the same age as me. She said that was her biggest worry when they finally, they're looking up in the clouds. They can rendezvous with a spaceship that's going around the moon, but they can't actually find the astronauts who have been plonked into the water. There's hours of looking around trying to find the capsule. Where did it go? That was another thing that she noticed when she was 10 years old. So I'm thinking, the 10-year-olds were worried about cooties, and they're worried about where the guys were going to land in the water. And, even a 10-year-old could see that there was some scary stuff going on. Nixon was not brave enough to go to the launch, but apparently he was brave enough to shake their hands when they got back while they were in quarantine. So, there's a few things that we might want to take a look at, revisit, if we are still convinced that and that's the other thing, we did not go to the moon. I think there was a group of people.
I say they. It's not whether we went to the moon. Don't put me complicit with them, please.
Well, I think, when we're talking about technology and we're saying, well, we can put a man on the moon, we want to be part of that. So that was where we said we went to the moon. And now we want to
That's why I changed it to they.
I can see where you might want to do that. I just wanted to ask you one more thing about the situation on the moon, because there were, it was very hot there and it was very cold there. And again, we have these spacesuits that I find fascinating because they have them on display. Now, what were those spacesuits made out of again? Do you know?
I think where they were hot and cold, I think that was called Menopause Mountain. It's an area on the moon there. And
oh dear. That's where all the bad men have to go.
That's right.
It's punishment.
Well, I mean, there's so many reasons. I mean, the Von Braun, who said, you need 30,000 times more fuel than they actually used. He said, as soon as you land, you have to go into a cave. I mean, you look at artist depiction that came out a year ago of Russia, bases on the moon, and they're built into the dirt. They're like little igloos built into the dirt because micrometeorites are raining down particles like grains of sand, constantly hitting the moon nonstop, tens of thousands a day, traveling at 20 to 30,000 miles an hour. So a grain of sand traveling at 20, 30,000 miles an hour is going to go through your brain, through your heart, through your spacesuit, cause catastrophic decompression of anything that's pressurized, the spacecraft, the spacesuit. He said there'd be a 50% chance every 24 hours of a catastrophic failure because of decompression. You have to go into a cave as soon as you land. And they never did. They're out galloping around the moon in front of micrometeorites, and they would have had a problem.
They're joking around. They got their golf balls. They've got. I guess that wasn't the first one. Did they
I
play
know.
golf the
I
first
mean,
time?
again, if they could go to the moon so easily in 1969, man would have been on Mars 25 years ago. It's so simple.
I'm wondering.
Lindbergh across the
They didn't
Atlantic
take a
in
telescope
27.
either, did they? That was the
50
other
years
thing.
later, they had 747s. I mean, when 1927, right? They fly across the Atlantic in an airplane. 50 years later, right? 77. They have 747 aircraft, huge things, and millions. See the advance they made in 50 years. So if they put a man on the moon at 69, 50 years later, there'd be hotels there. And I mean, the South Pole has a base, right? The South Pole is 100-mile-per-hour winds, 100 degrees below zero most of the time. And their base is there. Why? Because it's physically possible. If it were physically possible to have men on the moon, they would be there right now in a base. But they're not there, which means it's not physically possible. Right there. See?
There we have it. Now, Bart, I have to ask you, what are you involved in now? Because I can only just imagine where your mind is gone now. Do you think about things like this all the time, or are you focused on the moon most of the time? Have you got
No,
other projects?
I'm trying to move on. I'm writing a book for release in June of 2019 for the 50th anniversary. It'll be called "The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon." It'll be the backstory of the production of the film and Astronauts Gone Wild, and it'll be called "The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon." It'll have all the links to the films, the photo scan of the radiation readings from Geiger counters from 1959. It's right there. 5 to 100 times a lethal dose, right there. Von Braun saying it would take 800,000 tons times 3 rockets, and they use one rocket of 2,500 tons. It's right there with his signature on it. I mean, and then the window shot being faked and the shadows that intersect at 90 degrees, allegedly from sunlight, which is impossible. The floating around being slow motion, all that's in the film. There's so much more evidence than you need in the article, you know? And the book will be out and it'll be kind of largely based on that article and a few other little behind the scenes highlights.
Oh, well, that's something to really look forward to. I can't believe that actually next year is going to mark, what, 60 years? No,
50.
no, 50 years. I'm sorry. Yeah, 50 years. I'm,
Hey, you got
I'm,
another 10 years of life. You're welcome.
yeah, it's amazing, eh? We used to be the youngins, but
You are
funny how
now 10 years younger.
now we have to
Congratulations.
go. I guess that's why I have to frame everything. Literally, like within talking about frames, I teach filmmaking to kids, and it used to be that I could show them film, and I go, "Here's film," frames per second, and now it's trying to explain to them what a frame per second is, which is why I went into the Hasselblad
Oh, I know how you can
idea.
do it real simple. You go online to eBay, buy Fisher Price Viewmaster movie. It's a motion picture film with a cartridge. It runs at 12 frames a second. It's actually 6 millimeter film cartridges on a loop, and you literally one turn is 1 second or 12 frames. You can see a
Mm.
Bugs Bunny cartoon, actual film, through a magnifier. No batteries. Light comes through a little open area, and the cartridges are each a different movie. And
I
you'll
remember
be able to
those.
you'll be able to
Frightening.
show them what they go forward, they can go backwards, they can go fast, they can go slow, and they'll get it that it's multiple pictures. together.
That's great. Well, that's a great tip. I'm going to eBay right now. Well, I thank you so much, Bart, for
Sure.
joining us live. And I'm sure there are people in the chat, but I'm here by myself and I cannot be looking at the people in the chat. So I apologize to them because I'm sure they have lots of questions for you. But I'm going to say that if they look at your films and if they look at some of your other interviews, you've probably answered most of them. I think a lot of them are of a technical nature, and this isn't the last time you're going to hear from me on this subject. I've been gathering some old footage, and I think that I'm going to put together my own little montage of what people have said out of their own mouths, and then here we have Bart that has the courage to come forward and let folks know that things are not always as they seem. Now, I guess it's the bigger, isn't it Hitler that said the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it? It seems that
Yeah, that's a paraphrase. Basically, he said people tell small lies all the time. I'm late for work because some lame excuse that's not true. And he said when you tell a big lie, people don't expect it, and they're actually more likely to believe it. Something outrageous because it's unpredictable, and everyone's used to small lies, and that's what he was the master of propaganda. That's what going to the moon was, nothing but propaganda.
well, I don't think Kennedy would be proud. And I wonder about him. I know I said I was going to wrap it up, but I do wonder if he was aware when he said that. It almost feels like a bit of a PsyOp when he was saying that, because it was almost like he was trying to out the folks that said that we could go to the moon. I'm not sure what his purpose, but I really don't think that he believed that man could go to the moon within that decade. I just wonder why he gave that speech. Was he was he delusional?
Well, he's a visionary. He's not a scientist, right? And he was just saying, once he go up into Earth orbit, he seemed like only slightly farther. They didn't realize it was 10,000 times more complicated than Earth orbit.
But surely people had told him, that there is this, because Van Allen did come out with his
someone
studies.
Someone eventually told Johnson, because that's why he didn't run for re-election. He could have run for re-election, right? He became president after Kennedy's, after 50% of the term. He could have run for re-election, but he knew they were going to fake the moon landing very soon. And who knew that would work? It might work, it might not work. And he didn't want that blowing up in his face from Texas, where Houston is. He passed. It was the only time an incumbent, and one other occasion in 200 years of history, that an incumbent who could have run for re-election declined. And that was one occasion of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, people said it was over the Vietnam War, which he handily got us into, but didn't want to actually have to deal with. But I'm wondering, too, if there was some sort of distraction going on with all of this stuff. Like, let's just, and of course, there's the Kubrick side of this. I do have to ask you if you think that Kubrick was involved with this, but he had started, I guess, with the vision of the 2001 project. I mean, he really was kind of thinking about that in the early 60s, as far as I can understand. That was where it first came from. And also, he had just done Dr. Strangelove, which was about the Cold War. So if you take those two concepts, it's almost like the moon landing in 2001 was the alternative to a Cold War. We can work together and we can do things in a positive way, because I'm sure that Russia had something to do with this cover-up as well. They had to know. I mean, they if man had gone to the moon, I think Russia would have figured that out. And I'm just wondering why they haven't mentioned anything.
Oh, they figured it. They figured it out. The thing is, they could release it to the world, and that information would then become valueless. It's like, let's say they had a picture of the president with a prostitute. You could release it to the media and ruin him, or you could hold on to it and keep blackmailing him year after year after year. So that's what they've done. The more valuable use of that information is to blackmail the United States administration after administration after administration. Maybe some other countries are doing that as well. So another good reason to confess it takes away that power, you see. So.
Let's come clean. Well, thank you so much, Bart, for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time. And it's been interesting because there's a couple of things I've wanted to ask you, many, many other things. Is there anything that you wanted to end on? You've had some really nice endings, and I've kind of gone back to asking a couple of more questions. So why don't I just let you have the last word before we end today?
Well, we live in a sad, fallen world where, child molestation takes place and rape and genocide and murder, brother killing brother, religious scandals and political scandals. That's the world that we live in. So it's really not that unusual to think that they lied on a test in a race over something that everyone was happy to believe. They did do it, and until the truth comes out, those culprits are running our government, and that's not a good state of things.
Thanks, Bart. On that happy note, we will say goodbye, and I'm hoping that if we ever meet again, it will be under the circumstances of the revelation that man did not indeed go to the moon, and there will be Bart in all his glory, smiling after all these years of the cynicism. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you
Sure,
again.
Johnny.
Have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.
Take care.